My name is Jared McCormick. I'm the acting director and the director of graduate studies here at the Kevorkian Center at New York University. Sorry about the delay. We were sorting out some technical issues. Very excited to welcome you here to Excavating Alternative Histories. This is co-presented with the Arab Film Collab, which is Art to East, the Arab American National Museum, the Arab Film and Media Institute, and MISNA. And it is also co-sponsored by the NYU Center for Media, Culture, and History. I'm going to keep the introductions and the format, everything really brief. So just by way of the format, we have 3 speakers who each have around 10 minutes. So that will take us to half an hour. After that, and let me just, unfortunately, I'm going to mute you all. And when we get to Q&A, we can have you guys unmute yourself. Just back to the format. So the 3 speakers will each have 10 minutes that takes us up to half an hour. After that, we have our discussant come in, further the conversation. That's another 30 minutes, and then we hit Q&A. I just wanted to encourage everyone to, while the event is happening, remember that we're in this modality of Zoom. Feel free to type questions, comments, references in the Zoom chat, which we'll get to. When we get to Q&A, you can raise your hand, you can type a question there, you can reach out to one of us, any of the co-hosts, to feed us a question. The event is being recorded and it will be up in multiple places with the various partners. So I'm going to just, there's much to say about the esteemed, interesting panel of people that are here today. But I'm not going to read entire bios. So we have Naeem Mohaiemen, Adam Khalil, and Zack Khalil, filmmakers, artists, writers, activists wearing many hats and very well known. And some of you may have seen some of the work that is showing right now in the film collab. The discussant, we have our own esteemed here from NYU, Faye Ginsburg. She's the founder and the director for the Center for Media, Culture, and History. And she's a professor in anthropology and well suited to be discussing the set of issues on the table. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to turn it over to Gino Shueri to speak a little bit, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Jared. Hi, everyone. I'm Gino Shueri, the Films Program Curator and Coordinator at Art to East. And I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Arab American Fest Collab. Arab Film Fest Collab, a joint collaboration by 4 cultural institutions, Art to East, Arab American National Museum, Arab Film and Media Institute, and MISNA. The festival is featuring a program of films by the panel artists, which have been specifically selected to accompany today's discussion on excavating alternative histories. These films are screening until December 13th, and you can find tickets at the AFFC website, where student discounts are also available. There's a great lineup of films and programs, so I encourage everyone to check it out. We also invite you to visit the Alternative Archives, Discourses and Disruptions website, which is organized by Art to East, the Arab American National Museum, and NYU's Kevorkian Center. Here you will find resources around an ongoing series of webinars related to the Swana region, which explores artistic practices that tackle critical questions around storytelling and archiving in a rapidly evolving digital world. You can find the links to all the sites and film programs in the chat box. Thank you and enjoy the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. And so without further ado, we will get started. Naeem, you are up first.
Thank you, Jared, and good afternoon, early afternoon, everyone. Great to be here in dialogue with Zack and Adam Khalil and Faye Ginsburg. I'm going to show 2 short excerpts. There's a film of mine, Afsan's Long Day, which is on view within the collab. So this is another project. It's related to the idea of international solidarity, something I've been working on for a while, and in particular, the problems of solidarity, especially when asked to work across borders and in languages you don't speak necessarily. This project comes out of a photograph that was circulated widely in Bangladesh about a decade ago, which showed a group of fighters, black and white photograph, taken by Chris Steele Perkins, and the caption was Bangladeshi fighters for the PLO. So this photograph was seen as an example that Bangladeshis in the late 70s or early 80s were actively involved with the Palestinian movement to the extent of being fighters who went down to the site. And I started working on this project in 2014-15, went to Lebanon, spent time with friends. And as one of my friends said, when the short film was finished, he said, well, I'm not sure if this is the film that the world needs right now. And I said, why? He said, well, the Palestinian movement is already struggling to stay alive. We don't need someone from Bangladesh coming and pointing out what were the problems in the movement, which made me pause, made me think a lot, this idea, not only of criticality, this idea of criticality with love is a elusive, complicated idea. Sometimes people remember the critique and not the love. And then my Lebanese friend's point was that, you're from Bangladesh, this may not be your space to critique. In sum, what essentially happened when I went to Lebanon is I found out that this story of Bangladeshi fighters is partially true. And as with many other movements of international solidarity, there's a but. The but is, as far as my research established, that many of the Bangladeshi fighters who had come there in the 1980s came in the same way migrant labor comes, i.e. through manpower, export chains, agents in villages who tell you there's a job somewhere, you go in a group, you convince everybody in your village to travel with you, the agent gets a fee for transporting you. This is virtually the same network that today migration works alongside. There's a large financial aspect of migration always. And all of these people were looking for work, and the place they ended up was in Lebanon. And then they found out that their employer was what they referred to as the company Fatah. So it's also a moment of misrecognition where you come as one thing and you find possibly that the situation is something else. I'm going to show a short clip from an interview I did, a series of interviews that didn't end up making it into anything because the interview itself was so confounding. This was a representative from the PLO who's now retired. He was the official spokesperson. He told us about how, because of his English, Arabic, and French, he was highly valued at that time. And basically the interview is a lot of time spent me trying to get a good history, a glorious history. And a lot of times he's eluding that request. So this is just the raw footage from the interview. His name is Jamal Isa. So 1 second.
خلص ده اشيل عجله
الثيرد سيجرت يعني
هو الحديث هذا
مظبوط. ما هو بس انت مقضيها اجتماعات واحاديث. So most of them they came.
انا كنت بلاعب لما تيجي المره بس تيجي الرقابه العسكريه نشيل كل شيء. المهم
because it's on camera or just talking about cigarettes.
Cigarette and you have a
before my wife come for the control.
But he said this discussions made me want to smoke more. Okay, but those are so you didn't look at them. My question is, you didn't look at them as international fighters, as any international fighter.
لا مش عقائديين يعني هم قلت لك انه نظرة عامة فلسطين القدس هذا عنوان لكل المسلمين في العالم مش أسهل منه.
So in general they were just like, okay, we love Palestine. They weren't having like the international fighter who will come here and he will come from a left radical group who have the ideological. Those
مثل انه مثلا من الجنسيات الأخرى شاركوا في عمليات، ليش أقول أنا في مواجهات مع الهجوم الإسرائيلي، شاركوا في عمليات عسكرية ضد إسرائيل، يعني استشهد في عمليات اللي كنا نسميها انتحارية في هذاك الوقت، يمنيين وأكراد وعراقيين وكذا. ما عندي علم إنه مثلا في واحد يمني دخل الأراضي المحتلة واستشهد.
بنغلاديشي قصدك؟
بنغلاديشي قصدي، إنه في عندك علم أنت أو أنت يعني إن شاء الله أنا يا ريت يكون في 10.
He's saying that those international also will come here to fight, to make special operations against Israel, to hijack a plane or to go. But I never heard about a Bangladesh fighter who was really like he's talking about Bader Meinhof and the Japanese, who did really an operation.
Famous operation, but small numbers of people.
Yeah, small numbers. So I'm telling him you didn't look at them as international fighters. You know what I mean? Like as the same who came. So how you
هذيك المرحلة كانت أنت عارف في العالم كانت مرحلة حركات التحرر
صح.
في العالم.
صح.
طب ما في حركه تحرر، فيش حركه تحرر ترى البنغلاديش يعني انه
بس ما كنتوا تنظروا عليهم كهودي جايين يقاتلوا معنا، هودي جايين يشتغلوا معنا.
بالاخير هيك كانت النظره، في البدايه لا. يعني عندما الاعداد ازدادت هيك كانت النظره العامه. انا بكرر كلمه النظره العامه ليه؟ لانه اللي بديش ياخذ بالفتح بده ياخذ $200. طب ما اذا راح وقف حارس بنايه بامن وامان باخذن. ليش على فتح يعني يجي؟ ليش على ها؟
انه كان مؤمن بالقضيه،
انه مؤمن بالقضيه، بس مش يعني قلت لك مش على طريقه يعني الايمان العقائدي المطلق اللي ممكن في اي لحظه يقدم حاله او تحطه انت في المواجهه مع العدو.
saying of course they believe in the cause, of course, but not like in, because why he have to take $200 and fight? He can be work any work and like consider
بدل ياخذ
building and he
اكثر.
will get more even. At the beginning they used to look at them. He said at the beginning they used to look at them as like coming to help us in our cause, but when they become money and money
اكيد
they shift the look. بلاش تطلعوا على
طبعا
عمالك انتم.
طبعا.
So as I was working on the project, my friends' words rang in my ears about not making a film that highlights the weaknesses. The weaknesses here is the whole question of whether they were willing participants in the movement or not, whether they were basically migrant workers or whether they were fighters, how they were defined. You know, he does this whole thing, it goes on for a while, where he says, I never saw a Bangladeshi martyr, so where were they fighting? But towards the end of the interview, this goes on throughout the day. He also reverses himself and starts saying, no, but I think they must have come out of ideology, because, you know, he goes through this whole thing where he talks about how much money you could make working in other services. So then I put aside this project or this material that was the factual interview and made a different short film, which I'll show. And it becomes a way to talk about what happens when you find a story that you wish you hadn't found. And the only solution then is to make something that remains abstract about this fundamental question of volunteerism, whether these fighters volunteered or not. Share my screen again.
বলিয়া আরাফাত কোথায় রইলা রে, মোদের জনম গেল কাঁদিতে, আমাদের বলিয়া আরাফাত কোথায় রইলা রে। আগে জানতাম যদি ছাইড়া যাইবা, জানতাম যদি ছাইড়া যাইবা, ধইরা রাখতাম পিঞ্জরে, আমাদের বলিয়া আরাফাত কোথায় রইলা রে, মোদের জনম গেল কাঁদিতে, আমাদের বলিয়া আরাফাত কোথায় রইলা রে।
In the Al-Yom archives, everyone looks stark, faces in rehearsal, ready for what would come next. It's the light, someone explained. No tall buildings in 1978. Everywhere you stood, there was a golden light shining through. Even the dust had a magic sparkle. One man looks at the camera while others look into that special light. Beirut 1981 is a long way from Dhaka 1978. The dust here is of the wreckage of the aftermath, the after of the already too late. What were they thinking in this moment? To come so far and die in somebody else's war? A British photographer took that lone image in 1981, or maybe it was 1982. Buildings were already gutted, but that could have been earlier. 1973, 74, 75, any point really in the 100 Years' War. Sumaya found a grave in the Shatila compound She translates the Arabic for me. The martyr hero Kamal Mustafa Ali, and then in brackets, Bangladesh. Martyred on 22nd July 1982, Qalat al-Shukhaif, Lebanon. In the London office, there are no more photographs. In Beirut, Bilal will speak only if the camera points away. The paradox of time and the cruelty of decline, the end of the Third World International. Bilal has journeyed from Fedain to underpaid security guard. The word Fedain is pronounced the same in Arabic and Hebrew, but only in one does it mean those who sacrifice themselves. I am thinking about that other photo again. One more enigma inside the puzzle box. Standing still for one pose, and then, just like that, they vanish. They were not in the Tripoli newsreel either. As thousands boarded the last ship out of Beirut, missing at journey's end, rendered into a footnote. Were they waiting for Abu Ammar to arrive? To inspect their uniforms, give a smart salute, say a few words? La intifada, c'est moi. Après moi, le déluge. I'm looking now with quiet desperation. If thousands of Bengalis joined Fatah, as is claimed, where are their traces? What about this man, walking away from me? No, he's Arab, not Bengalis. How do you know? I know. Look at his walk. What about this one, the man with the gun? It could be. He does seem to be dreaming of home. Not home in Palestine, but home even further away.
আরে তুমি বন্ধু থাকো রে সুখে আমরা ফিলিস্তিনি কান্দি দেখুক রে লোকে আরে তুমি বন্ধু থাকো রে সুখে আমরা ফিলিস্তিনি কান্দি দেখুক রে লোকে ওরে আর কত কাল কাঁদবো আমরা আর কত কাল কাঁদবো আমরা সহে না যে পরাণে আমাদের ভুলিয়া আরাফাত কোথায় রইলা রে মোদের জনম গেল কাঁদিতে আমাদের ভুলিয়া আরাফাত কোথায় রইলা রে আগে জানতাম যদি সাইড়া যায়া জানতাম যদি সাইড়া যাইবা
So just to say by way of explanation that the first clip was the film I was planning to make, and the second one is the one I ended up making. Both its length and the slightly elliptical narration is done in order to not answer the question of whether they were volunteers or not. So it raises questions about, what are the sort of films you're supposed to be making, emphasis on the supposed, if you think that part of your work is supposed to be about uplifting, or also this idea of correct history. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much. Next, we're moving to Adam. You're up next.
Hey, Zack here actually, but yeah, thank you. And so great to be here in conversation with Naeem and Faye, whose work I admire so much. I'd like to start out just by introducing myself in Anishinaabe or Ojibway, my tribe, Ani Miskwani Band, the Indigenous cause, Pawating and Donjaba. My name is Zack Khalil. I'm a filmmaker and artist from Bawatang, or what is currently called Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, currently based in Brooklyn. I'm Ojibwe. My tribe is the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, and also Egyptian American, and kind of me and my brother jokingly refer to ourselves as Egyptian. I often work with my brother, Adam Khalil, who unfortunately can't be here today due to some travel difficulties. Then I was wondering if we could get, I had a presentation, a little slideshow set up. So I wonder if, James, you could pop up the first slide when you get a chance. And so I think our filmmaking collaborative artistic practice formally challenges the politics of representation that have so pervasively plagued Indigenous people in North America since the inception of the moving image. We're also trying to raise awareness about contemporary Indigenous sovereignty and shining a light on pressing Indigenous political concerns in America and abroad. I think in order to sort of understand our approach to our filmmaking practice in general and a broader collaborative artistic practice, it's important to first step back and consider the historical relationship between Indigenous peoples of the Americas and the moving image. The image that we're all seeing on our screens right now is one of the first moving images developed in Thomas Edison's laboratory of genuine Sioux Indians from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show dancing the ghost dance for a white audience's entertainment. Robert Flaherty's The Nook of the North, you know, an early piece of what we now call branded content for a French fur company, is often cited as the first documentary. And today, of course, it's recognized as a sort of patronizing and misleading depiction of Inuit life. But these early examples and countless other ethnographic films and documentaries about Indigenous peoples of the Americas and otherwise that came after them, they almost invariably embody the same unbalanced representational power dynamics that are at play in the museums and archives where the bones of our ancestors themselves have also been and continue to be imprisoned. And so for us, in order to reassert control over Indigenous bodies and knowledge in Western institutions, as filmmakers, we first have to confront this relationship between the moving image and Indigenous peoples. Ultimately, we want to make films that reject settler-colonial filmmaking conventions and instead use formal innovation to more accurately embody an Anishinaabe epistemology. My tribe alternately can be called Ojibwe, Chippewa, Anishinaabe, but they're essentially different ways of saying the same thing. But we also want like a guiding principle of accessibility in our films. Films made by Indigenous people for Indigenous audiences that can intrigue, educate, entertain non-Indigenous audiences. Films that can address the historical trauma of colonization while allowing space for levity and trickster humor, which is so much a part of our own culture. And also films that are really built upon a foundation of extensive research and sustained engagement with the communities that the stories come from. You know, I think for us, we think a lot about traditional anthropology's obsession with preserving images of our vanishing cultures through ethnographic films or archives filled with boxes of our ancestors' remains. And this has long been a tool used to colonize and oppress Indigenous peoples. By relegating our identities to the past and forcing us to authenticate ourselves via this past, our existence as contemporary individuals living in a colonized land currently is denied. The anthropologist encapsulating gaze ignores the fact that for Indigenous communities, tradition is not an immutable set of truths handed down by revelation, but it's like a set of ever-evolving social practices whose continuity can't be repaired through preservation, only elaborated through struggle and finally achieved under conditions of genuine self-determination. And I think that's so much of what our practice and our films try to do. If you could go ahead and switch to the next slide when you get a chance. So for my tribe, the Ojibwe, the struggle for self-determination is manifested in the Seven Fires prophecy, which is the subject of our first feature film, And Not to Say, which this is a short clip of. And Not to Say reimagines the Seven Fires prophecy, which is an Anishinaabe story which both predates and predicts colonization, the arrival of Europeans in North America. The story not only foretells their arrival, but also urges the Anishinaabe people to begin a great migration westward to avoid Europeans. It goes on to narrativize the devastating consequences of colonization, while also providing a direction for the recovery of the Anishinaabe way of life in the future. Our intention in using the Seven Fires prophecy to structure the film is to draw attention to the fundamental differences between Ojibwe history and the settler-colonial version of the history of our people, not only in factual detail, but also, more importantly, in utility and function. The settler-colonial version of our history seeks to encapsulate our past into tidy, sterile archives so that it may be safely forgotten, whereas the Anishinaabe version of our history seeks to use the past as a story which unites the entire tribe under a common purpose to be pursued into the future. And in the case of the Seven Fires prophecy, that's the revitalization of our traditional worldview after a prolonged period of systemic cultural annihilation. In this, I think another difference between the sort of Ojibwe and settler colonial conception of our history is that the Ojibwe conception of history tends to be more cyclical instead of linear. And in our filmmaking practice, we really like to try to think about different ways to apply that to cinematic form. So the image on the screen right now is from a long scene in the film, which takes place inside the archive of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. There's a lot of good Native American people that work at that museum, but that museum also has a really problematic and troubled history. Me and my brother sort of jokingly refer to it. It's as if you had the National Israeli Museum of the Palestinian. It's just sort of a strange concept that they're trying to execute there. But essentially, the scene in A Not to Say is one that touched on the problematics of ethnographic and museological practice from Indigenous perspective. You can actually go on to the next slide when you're ready. Our next short film, The Violence of a Civilization Without Secrets, sort of made this dichotomy its central subject. And it's our first work that directly addresses the repatriation of Indigenous human remains. The film itself sort of reflects on the innate violence of museum archives and the relegation of human beings to artifacts and property. The Violence of the Civilization Without Secrets investigates the discovery of the Kennewick Man. It's a prehistoric Paleo-American man whose remains were unearthed in Kennewick, Washington in 1996. While mainstream media proclaimed the Kennewick Man was proof of Caucasian presence in pre-contact North America, scientists sued to study it, but members of the local Umatilla tribe and other nations fought to regain access to their property, their ancestor, and rebury them in a secret location so that they could never be unearthed again. And so in this film, sort of through the lens of this one high-profile, controversial case, the film contemplates the sort of deep chasm that often lies between Indigenous and Western cosmologies and practices. We go ahead and move on to the next slide now. But these big sort of epistemological chasms and the efforts to bridge them are the subject of also our upcoming feature-length documentary titled Anakobajigan, which is a word in Anishinaabe, MON, which essentially roughly translates to ancestor, but it also means great-grandparent and great-grandchild. It's a word that kind of gets at that non-linearity that I was discussing earlier, where it denotes ancestors both past, present, and future, and where the importance is the relation through physical relation and not through time itself. And so this other film that we're working on is much more focused on this process of repatriation more broadly, and working with several tribes in Michigan who are working to return ancestors from museums and archives, of which there are still over maybe 500,000 sitting in banker boxes inside archives throughout the world. And I think that that's our sort of more directed filmmaking practice, trying to address these social issues. But I think we also take a much broader focus in our more collaborative work as the New Red Order, which is a public secret society, which me and Adam are members of, as well as a lot of other people. And that sort of arose out of the realization that, like, as Indigenous artists who participate in the art world, the settler-colonial states, that we're expected to provide knowledge in a sort of similar relationship to that between an informant and an anthropologist. Like I was talking about with our first film, Not to Say, which was about our community in Michigan, presenting that film at talks like this and film festivals, universities, museums, anthropology classes, realizing that we really are functioning as informants, and that's sort of inevitable, and that in our current period of existential and environmental catastrophe, that these desires for these Indigenous knowledge and epistemologies are increasing, and enterprising settlers continue to labor to extract this understanding as if it were a natural resource. And from an Indigenous perspective, this has really palpable consequences, from romanticization and commodification to appropriation and cultural erasure. And so the New Red Order, our recent projects aim to sort of redirect these consequences by exploring this desire for indigeneity, which pervades the myths, dreams, and political foundations of the so-called Americas. And so our sort of bigger question of our research as the New Red Order and filmmakers in general asks that, like, if these tendencies are so deeply entrenched in this nation's self-image, this desire for indigeneity, for these epistemologies, if this desire is so deeply entrenched that it's apparently inescapable, can it be studied, manipulated, or employed by Indigenous people to catalyze an expansion of Indigenous agency? Can we use our power? Can we use our power as informants to amplify the concerns of Indigenous people and to actually achieve material gains? And if this desire for indigeneity is reflected upon and redirected, can it instead be channeled to promote Indigenous futures? And a big part of that for us, I think, is also is calling people in. It's so frequent, calling people out for their interest in indigeneity or exotic cultures is so common and necessary, but it also doesn't seem to really, hasn't really seemed to gotten us very much. So one of the things that we're trying to think about is calling people in to, like, people do want to learn about Indigenous epistemologies, and I think there is a lot to learn about them. But first, we need to be able to have these sort of more broader intersectional conversations together, as opposed to sort of just exclusively rebuffing each other. And so that's sort of where I see the next steps, and where I see a lot of residents with some of Naeem's work in terms of international solidarity as well. One of the really big things that we advocate for as the New Red Order is the repatriation of all Indigenous land and life. Indigenous life, that refers to all of the ancestors whose bones, whose remains are held captive in institution. And the repatriation of all Indigenous land is exactly that, returning all of North America to Indigenous peoples. And I know that can have a seemingly maybe fascistic overtone, but I think there's a way of interpreting that doesn't mean kicking everybody out. It means sort of redefining how we think about property, belonging, and how we think about kinship and how we can relate to each other in more reciprocal ways in the future. I think that's just a little taste and a good start to that presentation. So thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Zach. And again, if anyone did miss it, Adam won't be joining us. So at this point, I think many issues have been kind of opened up and skimmed over. And so we're going to turn to Faye to offer her perspective, and we're entering into 30 minutes of kind of a general conversation between them. And again, you can type your question in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to all the folks from Kevorkian and the Arab Film Festival Collab for organizing this. And thank you so much to Zack and Naeem. I am an admirer of your works, and it was really fun to spend the morning watching everything again, and instead of grading. Sorry, students. And then thinking a lot about how they speak to each other. So I realized that not everyone will have had the opportunity necessarily to watch the specific works that were put together as part of the Arab Film Fest collab. I do hope you'll take advantage of this. One of the many interesting ways that film festival organizers have found to invite us into watching works during the current pandemic. So it's a very, very interesting. Just, I would really love to think about how, as a person who also does curation, like putting these together and in dialogue. So encouraging everyone to do that. I will be referring to that a bit, but trying not to do it so deeply that we lose people who haven't seen the films yet. So so the title of this is Excavating Alternative Histories and Alternative Archives. And I really think both of your works really, or I should say the two works by the Khalil brothers and Naeem, the work that we saw by Naeem, and then also the one that we saw today, which is very beautiful, thank you, which I hadn't seen, are really finding very interesting and innovative ways to address history as something that's not necessarily linear, that is also very intimate at the same time as aspirational toward utopian projects potentially. And one of the issues that I thought was so interesting between, and not to say, and am I pronouncing that correctly, Zach? I'm doing okay, thank you.
Yes.
Working on my Anishinaabe. And Naeem, is that both those works, the Afsan's Long Day, excuse me, and not to say, have a kind of aspirational super narrative. In the case of Naeem, it's this idea of international solidarity that's threaded through this very intimate and very moving diary of Afsan, your key character, who's a very, I guess, a very well known in many circles, writer and activist in Bangladeshi circles. And with Zack and Adam's work, the really fantastic way that you've recuperated the idea of the prophecies of the seven fires, which I know is across a number of Indigenous nations. And because the seventh fire is the one that we, that you address in the film, and many people talk about as the hopeful potential present to reclaim history and the present within the terms of the richness of Indigenous possibility and history. So I just wanted to throw that out there to maybe try and get a little crosstalk about the very, these very different films, but have a lot of shared ideas. Maybe I'll give you one more question just because I know often filmmakers want different things to grab onto. I think the other thing I really want to speak to is, because you're both really unbelievably innovative and creative filmmakers, is history's at the core of the work, but you really are rejecting linear kind of Western representations of history, including the way it shapes so much documentary work. And you work, the layering of the films you make, and you could see some of that already in the short bits of work that we saw today, of just, photography, animation, color, black and white, interview, realist interviews, old video footage, degraded but full of amazing moving story, just so many different layers. And to me, that feels like such a welcome disruption of this very, cleaned up idea of what we imagine history to be, the kind of, pardon me if anyone, I don't mean to insult PBS, but the PBS version of history. So, and the very last thing I just want, it's not the last thing, but let me just about three things, because like everyone works in trinities, I guess. So something I started thinking about early on in my work with Indigenous filmmakers, starting in Australia, is how much of the work I've seen and been very moved by and learned so much from is, and I think it really much applies to Naeem's work as well, is a kind of inversion of Freud's idea of screen memories. So really at the most basics, so his idea of screen memories was that people deal with trauma by covering it over with other kinds of memory that obscure the traumatic event. And it strikes me as over and over again in works I've seen, including the ones that I've seen of yours, that screen memories actually, particularly for people who are not in a hegemonic position or have, very rich other stories to tell, use the screen, in fact, to uncover the stories of past trauma and recuperate them on their own terms or on your own terms, so that, in fact, the trauma comes from the obfuscation and not, in fact, from the telling of the stories through your own, rich archival imaginaries, if I can use that language. Okay, so I just threw out a bunch of stuff to try and get some conversation going between the different projects that you're engaged in. And I just wanna thank you so much for your work and, and for the New Red Order, which we welcome into NYU. We all want to join if we can. So I just, either of you have any thoughts about that? I've got a long list of stuff, and I see stuff is coming up in the chat. So there are many ways we could go.
Should I share some thoughts just provoked by what you're saying, Faye? Fantastic provocations. I mean, I think I was thinking a little bit, the point, of course, is not a comparison, but I was thinking a little bit of Zack and Adam's project and how, it juts up against a dominant hegemonic history and institutions that have been around for many decades. So that there's a clear hegemonic force institution that requires dismantling. I think for my situation, particularly in South Asia and Bangladesh, it's a little bit of a different position because I would say the history of a communist past, which was supposed to be a communist future, or at least a socialist future, a red future, is oversubscribed in certain contexts that I'm in. It is the history that's shared quite often, and it's always tinged with this idea of inevitability, right? And that inevitability is so strong, it's messianic almost. It has a religious tint to it sometimes, which is why it's sometimes ironic to find former communists who are now engaged in spiritual politics in a particular way. I think there's a movement also there. But this is always the idea that it was supposed to be, and it was supposed to be inevitable. And the story of at least Bangladesh is that the inevitable didn't come to pass at all. And by even early 1981, 82, it was already on a path to becoming, sort of like a model capitalist implementing country. And today I call current Bangladesh to be capitalism with the seatbelt, safety belts off, or however you want to phrase it. So it's always a mystery as to why it happened. And one of the ways is I think somebody's got their microphone unmuted. It's a sound that's coming. It's not me. One of the ways is that. The reason I go back and look at this particular period is I'm always interested in looking at the moment before the inevitable success that was always predicted. It was always next year it's going to happen. And so a lot of the work that I do is often unraveling the moment where the standard narrative is that a much more powerful hegemonic force, which of course did exist, crushed our movements out of existence, whether that's inside Bangladesh or when Bangladeshis went to Germany and lived in East Germany as communist sympathizers, or when they went to Palestine with some mixture of both international Marxist solidarity and the nascent idea of Islamic nation, however it was expressed. the narrative is always that an outside force crushed those movements. And I usually look at what are the internal weaknesses in the movement that could also have predicted this. And I think that's also where sometimes I get into friction with, let's say, historians who take a quite activist position, and friends who take an activist position, which includes, I mean, I have an activist position as well, but mine involves going and looking at the errors or the moments of mistake, the moments of slippage, misrecognition. And another position is that, no, actually, we need to present a unified front, even in this history, because as my friend said in Lebanon, this movement is already half dead. We don't need a transnational project that looks at more flaws, right? So that's kind of one of the things I struggle with, and it's unresolved in my mind. It's probably the reason why last 3-4 years the works have all been fiction, because I haven't been able to figure out how to reconcile that within the form of documentary. So I'll stop there and pass it to Zack.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Naeem. I think it's super fascinating comparison and breakdown too between the sort of inevitability and being able to actually look at the flaws. And I think that's something also that Native American communities, historians, artists struggle with as well. There's this sort of idea that we need to promote positive stories about our people and about our movements and about our efforts against colonization. Whereas like the reality is that there's over 500 tribes in the United States, and often many of them were fighting with each other. Many of them had slaves. Many cooperated with various colonial forces. And that kind of tends to get erased in the broader history. Even talking about the Seven Fires prophecy, which is, something near and dear to me and my tribe, it clearly is a revisionist history that's created to motivate people now. And I believe there's real value in that, and especially for Native people who have been so been taught to hate themselves so long and so recently, and have only recently been able to be proud of who they are and proud of their history. I think they're part of that sort of glossing over of the flaws comes from that. It comes from being looked down upon for so long. But I really love and hear what you're saying, and think it's really a huge necessity in the future to really examine those flaws, even though it is sometimes painful and oftentimes pisses off a lot of people, to be frank, and alienates people. But without it, I don't think there can be hope for overcoming those flaws in the future. And that's something.
Oh, yeah.
I think we might have a little hiccup here. Okay, well, let's hope that he circles back and reconnects.
Jared, you might want to just text him or something to make sure he knows he's off screen.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, he might still be talking because it shows he's on and connected, not muted.
Yeah, this just happened to my daughter at a music rehearsal.
Zack spoke to my students 2 weeks ago, so that all worked well. In a different position.
So here's another question that I was hoping to direct to both of you, but I'll just start with you, Naeem, which is, I think it's kind of a perennial question that certainly, as I hope an anthropologist who's more not fitting into the kinds of characterization that Zack said, is to always think about who has the right to tell which story. And, is this, one of the first things we say to students in our production class is like, why are you, why do you have the right to have a camera in this location? And, what does that mean? And who gets to tell whose story and on what terms and so forth. So, it's, actually the very really interesting work that you shared with us today raises those stories or raises those questions so much about the rights to storytelling and history. So I wonder if you might speak to that a little bit? Also, let me just say, for those who have seen or haven't seen Afsan's Long Day, you have a really very, oh my gosh, like a Rubik's Cube structured narration built together from many of his really fantastic, insightful writings over time. So you kind of layered in his voice to tell that story. So so just what are your thoughts about that? Of course, I want to ask Zach the same thing when he's back on screen. And also, if you could talk a little bit, not just on screen, but your off-screen process in terms of how you negotiate the kind of off-screen ethics with your subjects, and do you collaborate in editing? How does that all work out for you?
Great question, Faye. And I think about the question of off-screen ethics, the process, it's constantly evolving with hiccups and mistakes on my part, certainly over the last decade. This is such a also volatile terrain to talk about, right? I mean, it can broadly be represented as a question of, who speaks for whom, who has the right, and we know that that question is playing out differently in academia, than within academia in anthropology, in cinema, in the visual arts, and so on, right? I mean, just to sort of go slightly tangential, just to bring in a very recent debate, the entire debate that, I mean, these debates are cycled, but the debate that started, let's say, from Dana Schutz and the Whitney Biennial, about a white artist painting black paint, and that debate, what I found interesting, because it's also the nature of our media, everybody was very certain about where they stood that year about that work and about that entire domain. But as things started unraveling, as it always does when more people start coming up, people don't cycle back and say, well, should we reconsider, right? So for example, a couple of years after that, Sam Durant was challenged as to his right to make scaffold, which included, of course, the execution block for Native people of Minnesota, even though for me, Sam is a different figure, let's say, than Dana Schutz, because he had actually worked with Indigenous people in Minnesota many years ago. But of course, with the half-life of media, there's no record of that. So Sam Durant appeared to people as, just a white male that year. And with none of his history being accounted for. And then very recently, there was a case with, Mocha in Cleveland, where an exhibition was pulled down of paintings of drawings of victims of police violence. And in that case, it's a Black artist and therefore African-American artist. So therefore, the discourse suddenly grinds to a halt, right? So it's constantly changing all the time. For me personally, I work on South Asia, I work on Bangladesh, and I connect it with other countries. That's a sort of particular position here in the US where I think it's more about it's ignored because there's not so many claimants to work on this space, right? But for example, Vijay Prashad, with whom I've worked before, when he was writing about, let's say, India or South Asia, that was fine, but the moment he started writing about the Arab world, one of the first questions that come up is, well, Vijay doesn't speak Arabic, so does he has the, that whole, so this starts constantly changing. Since you mentioned Afsan's Long Day, it's a Rubik's Cube, it's a puzzle box, and it's also elements that I wanted to bring together, even though they're not actually together in history, right? The Bangladeshi underground left and the Badr Meinhof have very little similarities, and they did not ever interface. So it's not even like Badr Meinhof and PLO, where there's a formal connection through the training camps, no matter how long that went on. But for the Bangladeshi underground and the German underground, there was no linkage, except for this one similarity, which is that the governmental response to me was similar, that the state responded by actually using these movements as the rationale for enforcing a security surveillance regime that they wanted to anyway. So the state had a vested interest in both Bangladesh and Germany to exaggerate the size of the threat, right? Which was kind of my place of interest. But many years ago, I was in Stamheim for a talk, and I said to the curator of the talk there that, oh, I have a few extra days, would you take me or arrange, I would like to go to Stamheim prison. This is many years ago, like 2004-05. And she said, why do you want to go to Stamheim prison? And I said, well, because it's where 4 members of Badr Meinhof die in very mysterious circumstances. And she just looked at me and said, but why? What's the connection with Bangladesh, right? And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And I said, oh, there's no connection, I'm just interested. And I think from that interaction, I remember having this willful idea of inserting the German narrative in there because I just wanted to, right? And put them in some sort of dialogue, which is not the work of formal history. Then what happens is the film starts circulating, and of course it starts showing in front of German audiences. And it's, the audience reaction is really interesting because it's it's polite about the Bangladesh section, we'll say that it's informative, and very sharp about the German section, right? You've got this mistake, or this is not the way it happened, and you're not sympathetic enough to the Stammheim prisoners. You don't talk about the fact that the German government used sound torture on them. How could you leave that out? All very legitimate questions, but I remember thinking, but how do they know that the Bangladeshi material is correct? That could also be incorrect. So I've also experienced audiences feeling like they have the right to challenge one portion, but not the other. And then, of course, there's the question of where the audience is in their own relationship with struggles in their own situation. So when Afsan has shown in Northern Ireland, there's a sharp response, because there the feeling is that to show anything that involves prisoners dying inside prison, whether they were on hunger strike or not, that, somebody said to me in that audience, very kindly, but also very forcefully, that you need to make it absolutely clear this is not a space for ambiguity, right? Because the slight ambiguity in Afsan's Long Day is that I start hinting at the fact that the 4 prisoners who die also started having conflicts within themselves, which is natural. You're inside the prison, you're away from the action, you start suspecting each other, you wonder if one of you has started striking a deal. There's sexual jealousy between the members as well. And this audience member felt that that couldn't be hinted at, right? So then it comes to the other thing I mentioned with Abu Amar, the question of responsibility. Are you being responsible in doing all this? And I think for me, one person who always influenced me from the first time I saw the work is Johan Grimon Prez, Dial History. Particularly because when it came out, or when I first saw it, I think it was like a year or two after 9/11, I just remember thinking, wait, somebody has just given us license/permission to laugh at something involving plane hijacking, which certainly in 2002 was the furthest thing from anybody's mind, both because of the collapsing towers and because of the war that was about to be unleashed on the world in its name. And I just thought, somebody who could do that, insert, disco music, and say, you can also laugh at the sheer madness and juxtapositions, ironies. It just kind of freed me in a way. So that doesn't really answer the question of like who, I thought of that when Zack came to my class. I thought, Zack is inhabiting indigenous stories in a way that people are not going to challenge him. But if I try to make another film about Germany, I could have errors. That's one thing. And of course I should be challenged on the errors continuously, regardless of whether I said this is within fantasy, fable, or documentary. But the fact that I'll only be challenged on those things, like I should be challenged when I touch Bangladeshi history as well. But certainly in the US context, left alone of like, oh, well, he's the expert because that's his history. And I want that to be continuously taken apart as well. My right to Bangladeshi history should be as much up for questioning.
Totally appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, and it's this fine line that we walk about, we don't want to all end up just in little ghettos of the tiny, cultural world we think we inhabit. So anyway, thank you. I see that Zack is back. Is that right?
Yes.
So Zack, welcome.
Zack, are you back?
Are you back, Zack?
There's a Zack marked box I see.
Yes.
Yeah, it's appeared and disappeared. He's been made co-host, so maybe he's not back until we have verbal confirmation.
I think that might be the other Zack. Remember at the beginning, there were 2 Zack accounts joining us.
He may have, also he just may have a very, as they say, an unstable connection. So Zack, I hope you can speak up when you return, because we'd love to keep this dialogue going.
Yeah, we're working on that behind the scenes. And let me just remind everyone, we're kind of rolling here in our fireside chat into Q&A. So feel free to raise your hand in the chat.
Great. There are definitely, so I could, I definitely, let me give Naeem one more question and then maybe we can start. How do we want to do this? Read the chat, have people put hands up?
Hands up is nice. I mean, in the sense it would be nice to hear from people.
Yeah. Okay, well, fine. Let's go to that. Shall we just go to we have some lovely comments. How do you want to handle that, Jared? You're in charge.
Yeah, why don't you do your question and everybody else think of, the issues at hand, and Naeem here, and hopefully we'll get Zack back. And we would love to have you kind of voice the question. I think it makes for a more dynamic event. So
I've been doing that with my own events, and the questions look great. So I'll make mine very brief. So this is just like, because I want to acknowledge like the what should I say, the incredible well, the creativity and the care and the innovation of the way you approach your visual material. So in Afsan's Long Day, it's, you are layering. So, first of all, you clearly did an incredibly deep dive into a lot of archives. And, so we have a little section of a little clip from the Murder on the Orient Express that flips into black and white graphic images of destroyed buildings after bombings in Germany and things like that. So I just wonder if you could perhaps, I don't know, briefly or at length, whatever, discuss a little bit about your process and how you work through such a complex, there are at least 10, I made a list, it was like 10 layers at least of everything from like on-camera realist interviews to, so many kinds of archival footage, of course, and across different places. And we're hearing the reading of a diary at the same time. So that's another kind of archive. So the different archival imaginaries that you put together so effectively. And I would ask the same question to Zack if he were on. I don't know where he is right now. So, all yours, and then we're going to go to the chat and to questions. And I'm happy to read all these great questions that are emerging.
So
just to jump in for, yes, yeah.
So I know Zack is back, so I'll turn to him, but just quickly, just to answer the question about archive heterogeneity, because that one definitely has that. That is also the last time I did that. After that project, I started becoming much more limited because I didn't necessarily want to do that anymore for various reasons. That project, Afsan's Long Day, started first as a talk I was giving. So that's also partially where the heterogeneity would come from, because I would have the laptop, I would play some music, I would pull things together and would change every time. And the reason I stopped doing it as a live piece after doing it, I think 5 or 6 times, is that there's this, sorry, not to give it away, but there's a sequence in Afsan's own words. So the words are from various people. Some of it is mine, but a lot of it's from the historian. And Afsan actually talks in a deadpan tone in my voice, so I speak the lines, about the day he was almost killed, where the police, Bangladeshi police, thought he was underground Marxist, radical. They were doing manhunts. They went to his house, and there was a mistaken identity case, but he almost got killed. And he talks about that. And I found, because I'm not a performer by training, that to do live inhabiting emotions it wasn't something I could really keep doing. So that's why it actually became a film, and that's partially where the heterogeneous material comes from. It was also, I think, it started in 2008. 8 is the first time I did it, then 2009, but it didn't become a film until 2014. So I think 2008, we were also all a lot more free about the use of archival material. My friend Sam Green, who made Weather Underground, says to me that his philosophy of archive is, you use it and then you see what happens. And then, you're also doing it in very DIY venues. You're doing it at a venue that it's 10 of you together putting on a talk. You're more free. You start becoming more conscious about the use of the archive. Things change about how the archive is seen, the whole idea of fair use and how you can only show 5 seconds at a time. I can't remember what the fair use length is. It's why any documentary about, let's say, Hollywood of the 1970s, any clip that you see, whether it's Jaws or Easy Rider or whatever, it's like the clip is frustratingly short because that's how they're staying within whatever the length is. In this one, you'll see there's much more of a prolific use of footage because all of those concerns hadn't really come about yet. And in fact, in the final version, the one that's online now, I actually replaced some footage because coming up to 2020, I can't just use that footage that I took, right? I have to go get licensed footage. So that changes what you can use. So that's one reason why the material is very, very heterogeneous. Why Murder on the Orient Express is in there is a way that my mind just works, which is that I don't necessarily think my own personal narrative or my family's narrative is central to Bangladesh or central to any sort of transnational story. I think there are many people who experience something like this, something similar, but I just happen to be the one working with it right now. Typically, what that sequence was about was the fact that in the 1970s, Libya, with new oil wealth, started importing workers in very large numbers, right? From socialist-leaning countries a little bit, that was one part of Gaddafi's project, and from Muslim countries, usually quote-unquote poor Muslim countries, that was also Gaddafi's project. So Bangladesh became one of the first countries to have huge number of Bangladeshis go over, and in very specialized fields. So my father went, he's a doctor, so it was 30 doctors sent to staff the Uqba bin Nafa hospital. It's a military hospital, and literally the whole place was staffed by Bangladeshi doctors for like 4-year cycles. And it's a very particular kind of development of the country's infrastructure as well, because you're developing the infrastructure with Bangladeshi doctors, Pakistani engineers, let's say, and Polish workers on the oil rigs, right? So you're developing infrastructure without training your own people, which of course was fatal for both Libya and Gaddafi later on. But the reason Murder on the Orient Express comes up is because there was only one cinema hall that showed English language films. And I just remember as a 6-year-old, this one film, Murder on the Orient Express, for those who haven't seen it, because it's a murder mystery, it's Hercule Poirot, but basically at the end of the film and end of the book, they all ritually murdered the same person with a knife to take revenge because that person can't be prosecuted. And as a 6-year-old, your moral universe kind of shatters when you see the good people murdering someone together. And it stuck in my head for 40 years. And I used that clip to introduce this idea, which was also true, which is that Libya stops showing English films at a certain point as tensions with England and the United States starts rising, right? As Gaddafi starts becoming an international pariah. And the film has a sequence in the Newsweek magazine cover where Gaddafi is now called an international terrorist. So it's a transition when English language cinema can no longer be shown. And I use that to chart out Libya's transition from a hopeful socialist Arab Muslim republic, however he represented it. It was kind of a hodgepodge melange to where it becomes a pariah. And I couldn't think of another way to do it, but I know that a standard historiography would not place Murder on the Orient Express anywhere in a history of Libya, because somebody might say, well, it's just random what cinema was. And it is in some ways random, but it's the detail that stuck to my head, which could then be worked into this story.
Wow, American parents would never let their 6-year-old watch that film. I just have to say that. So we're very overprotective. So Zach, welcome back. So the question that was generating such a rich conversation with Naeem was just one about who has the right to tell whose story. You made such a powerful case for it in your own presentation, obviously, and thank you for that cogent critique of the anthropological and the ethnographic. I hope we're getting past it finally to recognize the significance of work such as your own and many other Indigenous filmmakers. But also what I noticed within your film, and I would recognize this from many other works that and filmmakers I've had the pleasure to collaborate with, you are so careful to weave together throughout that, not to say that voices of elders, of people, like when people talk about the trauma of the residential school, it's their story. You don't try and tell that story for them. You weave in the old degraded video footage of these truly, terrifying stories of what people endured there and many other people. So we get a sense of this community, and we also see Bill, is that the guy with the Lakers sweatshirt who's quite a character? I mean, speaking back to your point about being, I'm going to say, fulfilling a seventh fire prophecy, but not being celebratory. So, the burden of representation is there, but you also make sure we see this big range of stuff. So I just wondered, like, you're thinking about how you weave those stories together and how you find those voices. I think one of the things you and Adam really eschew is becoming the authoritative voice to tell the story, although you are the voice that helps us, invites us into that world in such a powerful way, if that makes sense.
Totally, yeah, thanks so much for that question. Yeah, I think a big part of us and making that film was wanting to talk to as many people as we could from our community, and it being our community, meaning that so many people were willing to speak to us in the first place in a much more open way. I also think because of that, because we were from there, we knew that, especially in Native American circles, there's this sort of like, oftentimes certain people are seen as culture bearers and certain people aren't. And in my tribe and culture, they tend to be older men, and how kind of problematic that can be to have that be the only version of the story that's ever told. so I think for the process of making the film, we did, maybe 30 or 40 different interviews, and we also approached like the form of the documentary interview differently, where we weren't attempting to get like a sound bite. We didn't walk in knowing what we wanted to get immediately. It was much more of just like the process of visiting friends, visiting family, which was such a big thing up where we live in the north, where there's not too much to do, where you'd sit around for 6 hours drinking coffee, just kind of shooting shit in the, you know what I mean? So many of those interviews, ran 2 to 3, 4 hours as well, which was a problematic in the editing process, but also like kind of functions as research in and of itself. And also there's so much value in just the conversations themselves. And in terms of giving platforms, not just to older male culture bearers, but everybody, and people who, as I was kind of referring to earlier, a lot of people think because of respectability, politics shouldn't be shown, but are a part of our community and do have really cogent and powerful political stances that not everybody else has. And then thinking so much about archival too, is really appreciating what Naeem was saying, and how important archival is to our practice as well, and how it doesn't always have to have this super direct connotation or connection, but it can be a sort of a diagonal or emotional connection or an ephemeral one, or something that you just like can't quite put your finger on, but it works for whatever reason, and not staying so close to authenticity in that sense. And then me and my brother were also really fortunate, just that our tribe has a huge archive of its own, has thought of using, as soon as video became accessible on a consumer level, started documenting the history of our tribe and our elders. And our uncle has a basement full of VHS tapes, half of which are like official tapes produced by our tribes. They're just interviews with elders, and the other half of which is like every Hollywood movie featuring Native Americans ever. So we kind of had this like amazing archive to pull from in the first place, and the one through line being they're all our Uncle Richard's VHS tapes. So there's sort of like associations that can be made throughout, no matter what. And it also makes you think about, I think, what you jokingly kind of mentioned, just like the sort of the PBS version of history, or the PBS version of using archival. And that really struck a chord because it was such a big, in making our first film, and not to say, the first 6 minutes, I edited it, and me and my brother always jokingly referred to as like the PBS section, like just to reach a wider audience and to speak to people who don't know anything about where we're from or our tribe, that sometimes you do need to spell things out in that super obvious way, and that accessibility is important to us as well. But for us, like, that's a launching pad to sort of pull a bait and switch with people a little bit, to pull people in, to make it accessible, and then to, when things start to get strange, to really kind of get people off their balance, so they don't quite know exactly what to expect next, which I think is a really crucial and important part of making films and making art that actually leads people to new conclusions and new ideas, as opposed to just sort of getting what they thought they were getting at the beginning of the film. And just the texture of archival, I think, is also really important to us, to not prioritize pixel ratio or anything of that sort. And it's interesting, whereas with like film grain, old film grain archival, that has a vein of authenticity to it too, right? Whereas it's the same thing with high 8, with a low pixel resolution or pixel vision, which can, I think maybe one just last interesting tidbit to, I think, a piece of archival that you were referring to earlier, it was a tour of a residential school, a boarding school, where they sent Native children so that way they would learn not to speak their own language. And that was a tape recorded by my aunt, who's maybe like in her 80s now. And she was did it as part of an Anishinaabe Moen or Ojibwe language class, where they thought that if everyone was going to learn the language, they should learn why the language was taken away in the first place. But also that my aunt at that point, my family had been rooted in Sault Ste. Marie, but my parents didn't grow up there. And my aunt actually studied ethnography at Harvard. And so when she was recording that tape, I think she was recording it in a very different tradition than the way that me and my brother ended up using it. Whereas I think she really was approaching it as both as an insider and as an outsider, and also just recording it for posterity. And that's something that honestly I'm not sometimes super proud to admit. But I think also because of the way that it was used, I'm really happy that she did it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we're going to move on. I just want to say that that with the way it's subtle, but the connection between all the Jesuits, the Black Robes, right, and the residential school, I mean, and the deep dive into the emotional cost of that, and frankly, the visible forms of video degradation, tells you something about how that was taken in that kind of more informal way. That's, I find, very powerful. So thank you so much for that. I think that I'm getting looks or something that we should open up to audience, right, guys?
Well, yeah, we're open to the audience, and unfortunately, I think Faye has to leave and Naeem right around 2 sharply. So I encourage everyone, this is your chance if you want to pose a question. The rest of us, we can stay and linger and chat, but the event will maybe kind of conclude shortly.
Yeah, I apologize because it would be so much fun. Yeah, it's just the end of semester press is like kind of wild right now. So I'm going to read Jennifer Shutek's question. Does that sound like a good way to jump into audio? Oh, wait, hold on. I'm going to go back a little bit. Okay, find the ones that Jamila Weiss, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. How do you, this looks like it's directed to Naeem. And since Naeem has to leave, maybe we can start here. How do you define, in quotes, international fighters? Maybe you can see this also in the question chat area. It is interesting to see that the Palestinian movement is working globally, which is somehow a different idea than ideas suggesting that Palestine is a global story through domination. For example, Khalili's book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, A History of Settler-Colonial Conquest and Resistance. But here you show it through resistance and solidarity. So more of a comment. But just to start off our conversation with the people distributed in Zoom space here.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can clarify what might have become truncated when I was first talking about the project. I did not go with the intention of not finding the evidence. I actually wanted to find the evidence of thousands of fighters. The part that didn't quite jibe is the fact there's a piece by Yazan Al-Sad, which I posted on the chat, which is that why there was just one photograph, right? Why this one photograph by Chris Steele Perkins? He has 2 versions of it, one that's kind of badly cropped, so that, or not badly cropped, framed differently. So this is the one that circulated and was published. And then it's really the caption, right? Other than the caption, there's no other sign that they're Bangladeshi. And not all of them are. The taller man is presumably Palestinian, the one more curly hair in that picture. I went looking for evidence, but I also had this sort of worry in my head of like, why isn't there more? And I went to some very sort of, I went to Arab Image Foundation, I went to the library, I actually went looking for the evidence of international fighters in large numbers. And then only when I didn't find them is then when I started looking for other things, started to do interviews, trying to people. And I think part of, I referred to this in the chat, I got into, I wouldn't say hot water, but I definitely got into a little bit of a micro internet debate when Yazan's article came out before my film, because I sent a letter into Al-Akbar saying that, there's something incorrect here about saying that thousands were there. I talked about why there could have been an incentive to inflate the numbers because Bangladesh was repositioning itself by 77 away from the socialist axis, which essentially was dead in 75 with the assassination of the first prime minister, towards a quote-unquote Muslim nation Ummah axis, for which Palestine emerged as a, this is also one of the paradoxes of the Palestinian movement, that it emerged as a Muslim issue rather than as a sovereignty issue. sovereignty issue, then you could argue that, well, the Bangladeshis should have, been campaigning for, let's say, Sri Lanka or any other much more local fight for sovereignty. And so I think the idea of Bangladeshis being international fighters who are very in the movement of the time is very appealing to Bangladeshi historians and activists. And for me, in some ways it's appealing, but I think the evidence doesn't quite line up. And that's why I wanted to, but that's also why the film is the way it is. It never answers the question. It says, if hundreds or thousands of fighters were there, where are their traces? But it never answers the question, because I was also mindful of my friend's exhortation to not, to not deflate the story, what residue remains. Yeah, so I think it's a very particular kind of, okay, so here's the thing about international solidarity. You also don't need thousands, right? Many of the examples that we look at from the 1970s, they are actually small numbers, right? And those small numbers can project many things. The Japanese Red Army, for all their, celebration as being involved in the Palestinian movement and these events that they carried out, the numbers were actually quite small. And so small numbers doesn't necessarily get in the way of international solidarity, but there's something there in the slippage, and the idea that people could have gone as migrant labor and then been conscripted into an army, that really resonated me with in a particular way, which is of course the idea of whether you volunteer to fight or not, right? And one book that hadn't come out at that time, otherwise I changed my thinking, is Daryl Lee's Universal Enemy, which came out this year, which is about foreign fighters who went to Bosnia. It's a dense ethnography, and I think that work also wasn't there, so I didn't have another way to think through it. So that's why it's also an unresolved project. It's only 6 minutes. It doesn't try to answer the question, it just is a provocation, and maybe me talking after the film does more than the film itself does.
Thank you so much. That's great. So there's a question here for, let's see, addressing Zack and Adam's film. This is from Jennifer Shutek. It's, I'm going to just read it here. It's so fascinating to hear you discussing a in parentheses colonial longing for Indigenous knowledges. I come from a food studies background and see this from a food and nutrition perspective as well. Do you see a way to raise wider information about Indigenous knowledges without tokenizing or perpetuating a long hangover of a noble savage trope? If so, how? Thank you.
That's a great question, really appreciate it. And yeah, food sovereignty is really, really important. So it's really exciting to hear that you're doing that work. And it's something that's, yeah, so important to Native communities who've been so decimated by diabetes and other things from not being connected to our traditional food sources. So yeah, I think there definitely is a way of sharing and spreading that knowledge. And I think that's something that the New Red Order is really interested in general, is saying that, like, yes, this is knowledge that we should and can share. But I think that the main crux of having that not be something that gets sort of extracted in this terrible way is that there has to be some sort of reciprocity involved, There's so much, you can see it, there's so many wild rice that's sold with like Native American branding, but no Native American ownership. So I think there's ways that information can be shared, but I think Native people are understandably worried about having their, oftentimes intellectual property stolen too. When you talk about things like Monsanto and genetic seed patenting, and there's all sorts of, the University of Michigan has an amazing archive of seeds that go back hundreds of years, actually, that they're working to repatriate to tribes. And they have to be incredibly careful about who has access to those. They planted some in a garden, but the concern is that you can have one person from a biotech company take one leaf from that, genetically code it and patent it. So I think as much as there's a lot to learn and share in terms of that, there's also a lot of fear about what can be extracted sort of irrevocably. But also, if I would like to say that if people are more interested in engaging in some of these conversations in ways of gaining access to Indigenous knowledge systems in ways that are more reciprocal, that the New Red Order is a public secret society that is open to anyone, Indigenous, to join. And you can join by going to newredorder.org or calling the hotline at 188-NEW-RED-1. And one just last piece that I thought that Naeem made me think of in terms of international solidarity and how often it doesn't take that many people. Me and my brother worked on a film for a while comparing Palestinian refugee camps and Native American reservations. And one of the stories that we learned on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which was one of the most famous reservations in the United States, is that the first limousine on the Pine Ridge Reservation was Yasser Arafat's, and that they sent a delegation over to Palestine as well. So it's also that like these movements and communication between them have been going on for a long time, and it doesn't always have to happen in the thousands in order to be important.
It's a great story, thank you. So Jared, I was gonna potentially, if we had a couple minutes more time, ask Zack if he wanted to talk about the Cousins Collective, which are you and Adam both part of that new collective?
Yeah, I've been helping out.
Just very quickly, because I think that's a very interesting one of a, in quotes, international, as in between different First Nations communities of Sky Hopinka and you guys, and you know, some First Nations folks up north. And anyway, so I don't, you know, just as a, speaking of international solidarities of different kinds, so maybe we can close up on that for, and then go to breakout rooms or something like that. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great. Yeah, Cousins is dedicated to sort of promoting Indigenous film that thinks sort of outside the boxes of traditional documentary or settler-colonial filmmaking. And it tries to sort of fill a funding gap there, where something me and my brother run into where in the United States, there's not a lot of funding in general for filmmaking, but especially for Native filmmakers. And in Canada, there's a lot of funding, but it's tied to the government, right? So you're expecting the Canadian government to fund a film that ostensibly calls for the, you know, taking down the Canadian government, which is not, does sometimes happen, but it's pretty rare. And then in America, that yes, sometimes there's PBS, Vision Maker Media. There's a few funding sources, but they tend to have a lot of oversight. And I think there's a real, I think especially as Native filmmakers and just as first-time filmmakers in general, there's a tendency to want to make your film look like another movie. So that way, to establish its legitimacy, I think, in a way, which I think can prevent people from experimenting formally. And it kind of just gets to our point earlier about how Native filmmakers are often supposed to sort of copy the settler-colonial form and aesthetic of filmmaking, when there should be, I think, a lot more energy and funding, frankly, funded going towards encouraging Native filmmakers to think about cinematic form in the ways that their own tribe's epistemologies can create different kinds of films, and not just in the content, but in the form as well. And so Cousins is a nonprofit that's started to exist to fund films that attempt to do that and to encourage that more generally.
Very cool. I just want to give you a moment of product placement for that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I mean, that's maybe a good place, because I know, again, in terms of time, some people do have to leave. So thank you so much, Faye, Zack, Naeem. And so this will be the end of the formal session. We'll stop the recording. For people that wanted to stay and stop the recording.